The letter arrived, folded inside a weather-stained envelope with no return address. Just my name, Dr. Samuel Whitaker, scrawled in uneven ink across the front. I remember how I held it up to the morning light of my study window, trying to discern something beneath the paper, perhaps a hidden note, perhaps a smear of blood. I don't know why I suspected it then, but something about the way the parchment was creased, almost trembling in its folds, gave me pause. I opened it slowly, expecting the usual requests: a malformed child, a dying curiosity in some medical tent, or another spiritualist claiming to channel the lost. But this was different. The letter was short, no more than a dozen lines. It said there were 4 brothers, hidden deep in the Kansas frontier. They lived alone, never aged, never spoke in town, and their bodies were not, in the sender's words, completely human. The final line read, "If anyone can understand them, it is you. But I warn you, doctor, some things science ought not to touch." The handwriting was jagged, rushed, as if written while glancing over the shoulder. The signature was just initials, J.M., no address, no date. But the paper carried a distinct smell, iron and damp soil, as though it had been buried before being sent. I should have thrown it in the fireplace. I should have laughed it off, as my colleagues would when I mentioned it later. But I didn't. I placed the letter in my satchel and locked the window, suddenly aware of how quiet my townhouse had become. That night, I lay in bed longer than usual, listening to the old wood creak beneath the floorboards. A house settling, yes, but also something else, like footsteps that stopped when I breathed too loudly. The next morning, I presented the letter to Professor Langley, my superior at the Boston Anthropological Society. He gave a dry chuckle, muttered something about Kansas hicks and opium hallucinations, and waved me off. "If you want to spend 2 weeks being chased by cows and coyotes, go ahead, but don't expect the society to pay for it." I didn't argue. I'd saved enough for the trip myself, and some pull I couldn't name, had already taken hold. There's a point at which logic becomes a cage, and curiosity is the key that doesn't fit, but you turn it anyway. By sundown, I was seated on a westbound train, watching the clean stone edges of Boston give way to endless yellow plains and grainy twilight. I didn't know what I was going to find in Kansas, but I knew, even then, that I would never fully return. The train left me in Abilene, just past midnight. The station was little more than a wooden shed, with a flickering lantern swaying from a crooked beam. I stepped off with my trunk in one hand, and the letter in the other. The station master, an older man with a clouded right eye, glanced at the address I showed him, and froze. "Marlowe's Corner," he repeated under his breath. "That place isn't on any timetable." I told him I had business there, medical inquiry. He looked down at the ground, then muttered, "There's a man with a cart who passes through once a week, leaves before dawn. That's your best chance." But I wouldn't linger too long there, Doc. That town don't keep strangers well. I waited by the edge of the dusty road, until the sky shifted from black to dull lavender. True to the old man's word, a lone cart came crawling over the horizon, pulled by 2 skeletal horses, and driven by a man who didn't speak until I showed him the letter. His eyes darkened, and without a word he gestured for me to climb in. The journey from Abilene to Marlowe's Corner took half the day, yet it felt longer. The road was lined with endless wheat fields, but not a single bird circled above, and no sound rose except the rattle of the cart. The driver hummed something tuneless under his breath, a melody that rose and fell like a lullaby sung wrong. When I tried to speak, he only shook his head, tapping once on the leather reins and quickening the horse's pace. We reached Marlowe's Corner in the heat of late afternoon. The town was barely a dozen crooked buildings sinking into the soil, their paint long peeled by wind and neglect. A boarded-up church sat in the center like a cracked tooth. The streets were empty, but I saw movement in the windows, curtains pulled back, eyes watching. As I stepped off the cart, the driver pointed to the north, past the town's edge, toward a crooked path that disappeared behind a dying grove of cottonwoods. "Their place is that way," he said. "You walk, cart, don't go further." And with that, he turned the horses and vanished into the dust, like he'd never been there. I walked alone, the gravel crunching beneath my boots like bones, the trees bent as if they were leaning to listen. As I reached the edge of the town, a boy, no older than 10, stood barefoot in the road, watching me with wide eyes. He didn't speak. He just pointed to my chest and whispered, "You'll be 5. Then he turned and ran into the trees. I stood frozen, the wind tugging at my coat, and for the first time I felt the weight of the land pressing in, not just empty, but hollow, as if something had carved out its heart long ago. The path beyond the trees led through a narrow stretch of broken cornfield, where the stalks stood unnaturally tall and dry despite the recent rain. Their tips curled like burned paper, and every few feet I saw crows nailed to fence posts, wings splayed open, beaks split. They weren't rotting, they looked preserved, frozen in death. The air was unnervingly still, not the stillness of quiet country life, but something denser, as if the very wind had decided not to pass this way anymore. I tightened my grip on my bag and walked faster. The corn parted with a sound like whispering silk, and with every step I felt watched, not from behind, but from below. The house emerged suddenly, a massive gray structure that seemed older than the land itself. Its roof sloped unevenly, and the chimney leaned like it had been holding its breath for decades. Moss clung to the lower bricks, and above the front door hung a rusted iron symbol I didn't recognize. A crooked cross bisected by a circle etched into the wood with something sharp. The porch sagged under my weight as I approached, the boards groaning low, like a voice trying to rise from the floor. I knocked once, no answer. Then again, I waited. A shadow moved across the second-story window, tall, slow, deliberate. Then the front door creaked open, not by a hand, but as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was cold, not from weather, but from something older, deeper, like stepping into a crypt. The hallway stretched long and dark, lined with faded portraits of people who all looked vaguely alike, tall, pale, distant in their expression. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, exposing claw-like scrapes in the wood beneath. Then I heard it, footsteps, not hurried, not cautious, just precise. A tall figure stepped into view from the shadows at the end of the hall. He wore a white shirt, stained at the cuffs, and his face was long, angular, with eyes so dark they seemed to drink in the light. He didn't speak, he just looked at me, and tilted his head, not like a man, but like something trying to mimic one. "I'm Dr. Whitaker," I said, voice wavering. "I was sent here to understand." Still no answer, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or approval. He turned without a word, and walked deeper into the house, and something compelled me to follow. As I passed through the threshold, I felt it, that this place wasn't a home. It was a waiting room, and the brothers, they were waiting for something more than me. He led me down a narrow hallway that seemed to bend slightly with each step, as though the house itself shifted behind us. The wallpaper grew darker, slicker, the air thicker. I caught a glimpse of movement in one of the rooms we passed, a figure standing still behind an old lace curtain, watching. But when I turned to look again, it was gone. We reached a large parlor with high ceilings and windows that had been painted black from the inside. The room should have been suffocating, but instead it was cold, the kind of cold that settles into the bones. In the center sat a wooden table set for 5, though only 2 of us were present. The man, the one who'd opened the door, gestured for me to sit without speaking. Then he moved to the far side of the room, where 3 other men stood in near perfect stillness. They were arranged like statues, shoulder to shoulder, staring straight ahead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized these were the other brothers. One had broad shoulders, arms far too long, fingertips nearly reaching his knees. The second was shorter, but his eyes were entirely white, no iris, no pupil, and his skin was the color of bruised ivory. The third, something about him unsettled me most. He looked normal at first, until I saw the way he moved. Not step by step, but like a film missing frames, one moment in place, the next beside the door, without the in-between. None of them spoke. Instead, they watched me with expressions that hovered somewhere between curiosity and hunger. I introduced myself again, my voice dry, my mouth barely forming the words, Dr. Samuel Whitaker. I've come to study, to help if I can. One of them tilted his head slightly. The one with the long arms took a single step forward. The floor groaned in protest beneath his weight. He opened his mouth slowly, and for a moment I thought he would finally speak. But instead he exhaled, a long, low hiss that smelled of metal and wet soil. The sound vibrated in my chest, not in my ears. Then, as one, all four brothers turned and walked into the darkness of the hallway. No words, no instructions, just the same silent invitation. Follow, and I did. They led me outside, through a back door that swung open before any of them touched it. The sun had dipped just below the horizon, and the fields beyond the house shimmered with that eerie golden stillness that comes right before night takes over. I followed them across a narrow trail flanked by withered trees and dry grass that crackled beneath our steps. Not one of them looked back to see if I was keeping pace. They moved like they'd done this hundreds of times, in perfect silence, as if they shared thoughts without ever needing to speak. As we approached the barn, I noticed its odd construction, too tall, too narrow, and painted black not with paint but with something thick and sticky that caught the dying light like blood under moonlight. The door creaked open with a shudder that echoed into the night. Inside, the air was denser than anything I'd breathed before, warm, damp, with an underlying stench of copper and old meat. The walls were lined with strange wooden racks holding tools I didn't recognize, twisted, bladed instruments, long glass tubes, and dried herbs bundled with animal hair. In the center of the barn was a shallow pit, no more than 6 feet across, but ringed with symbols carved directly into the packed earth, circles, intersecting triangles, runes I couldn't read. The ground around it was blackened and sunken, as if something heavy had burned there without fire. The brothers formed a square around the pit. I stood just outside it, hesitant, but drawn in by something I couldn't name. Then one of them, the one with the white eyes, stepped into the pit and removed his shirt. His torso was covered in scars, not from injury, but as if someone had etched symbols into his flesh with surgical precision. And then I saw it. The scars were not scars at all. They pulsed, slightly, like veins under the skin. He looked straight at me, and tilted his head back. The others began to hum, low, rhythmic, unnatural, their voices layered like bone on bone. I wanted to run, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. My feet rooted to the floor, my breath shallow. And then for the first time, the eldest brother finally spoke. He listens, he said, in a voice dry as dust, but he never forgets. I didn't know if he meant me, or something else entirely. By the time we returned to the house, night had fallen completely, not just the natural kind of darkness, but a still, suffocating black that swallowed the path behind us. The brothers walked ahead, unchanged, while I lagged a few paces behind, shaken and cold, despite the heat still clinging to the air. When we entered through the back door, I noticed something unsettling. The inside of the house had shifted. Doors were in different places. The grandfather clock I'd seen in the parlor was now in the hallway. It ticked, but the hands didn't move. I told myself I was tired, that I was imagining things, that this was just the disorientation of travel and unease. But in my gut, I knew better. They led me to the dining room again. The table was now fully set, 5 places, each plate perfectly aligned, cutlery arranged with obsessive precision. The meal itself was unidentifiable, slabs of grayish meat, thick root vegetables dyed unnatural hues, and a thick black syrup that smelled faintly of iron and rosemary. The brothers took their seats in perfect unison, folding their hands and staring at their plates. I waited for one of them to speak, to offer a blessing, a toast, anything, but they simply began to eat, each bite chewed 12 times, each hand lifted at the same angle, each sip of that thick syrup taken in a synchronized rhythm that chilled me more than any scream ever could. I tried to eat. Out of politeness, I cut into the meat. It bled, not red, but something deeper, almost blue. It twitched once on the plate. I set the fork down and sipped water instead, though it tasted faintly of ash. Throughout the meal, not one of them spoke, but I could feel something happening, a rhythm building in the room, like a slow pulse echoing through the floorboards. At one point, I looked up and caught them all staring at me at once, every face frozen, every eye fixed on my hands. Then, just as quickly, they returned to their meal, chewing once again in perfect time. It wasn't just that they moved in sync, it was that they moved as one. When the meal ended, the eldest brother stood and walked to the fireplace, placing a single hand on the mantel. The fire flared up violently, then died back to a low glow. He turned to me, and without a word pointed to the stairs. It was time to sleep. I nodded, forcing calm into my limbs. As I made my way up the narrow staircase, I felt their eyes following me, not out of curiosity, not out of suspicion, but like they already knew what I'd dreamed that night, and they were eager to watch it unfold. The room they gave me was clean, but wrong. Not a speck of dust, not a wrinkle in the sheets. Yet everything inside looked as if it had been preserved, not used. The bed was firm, untouched. The mirror cracked in one sharp diagonal line, and the wardrobe door opened on its own every time I looked away. I placed my medical bag beside the desk and lit the oil lamp. The flame danced oddly, not from a draft, but as if swaying to something unheard. I was exhausted, but too unsettled to sleep, so I did what I always did when my nerves stirred. I wrote. I opened my notebook and began documenting the brothers' physical traits, my observations carefully noted, like I had done for dozens of field cases. Elias, the eldest, approximately 6'5", pronounced jawline, fixed gaze, skin pale but not sickly, almost translucent under direct light. The second brother, with the long arms, abnormalities in joint rotation, elbow flexibility beyond natural human range. Third brother, missing 3 fingers, but displayed perfect dexterity. Fourth, the white-eyed one, reacted to movement faster than I could blink. I had not seen them eat meat with any preference, nor drink water beyond a few sips. Their pulse, when I managed to casually brush a wrist, was irregular, or perhaps layered. I noted down multiple frequencies in one body, then paused. That made no sense. I decided I would request formal examinations in the morning. I was still clinging to some thread of scientific detachment, still pretending this was just an extreme genetic anomaly, a case I could report to the society. But then I noticed something beneath the edge of the dresser. I bent down and pulled out a small scrap of paper, yellowed with time, a drawing. It had been made with charcoal, crude lines, but unmistakable. 4 tall figures standing over a fifth, much smaller. The fifth was lying down, eyes closed, mouth open in a silent scream. All 5 had the same eyes, my eyes. I turned the paper over, scrawled on the back in a shaky hand. He must forget himself to join. My hands went cold. I looked toward the window, but there was nothing outside, just the field, and something tall standing very still near the barn, watching. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with my notebook clutched to my chest, every shadow a threat. The air in the room grew colder, the longer I stayed awake, And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I could hear them, the brothers, walking the hallway outside my door, not randomly, not aimlessly, in circles, slow, even, deliberate steps. They weren't guarding me. They were waiting for something inside me to change. By morning, the house had grown colder, not the kind of chill you feel on your skin, but the kind that settles into your bones before you even know it's there. I found the brothers already awake, seated at the table again though no meal had been served. They weren't looking at each other, or at me, just sitting, hands folded, breathing as one. I asked if I might begin my examinations. No response, not even a flicker of interest. Elias slowly stood and walked toward the far hallway, his steps measured, the others followed. And again, without being told, I followed them. At the end of the hallway was a door I hadn't seen before, one I could have sworn wasn't there the night prior. Thick, dark wood, reinforced with iron braces across the frame. A heavy chain wound through a series of bolts, fastened with a padlock larger than my palm. My eyes were drawn immediately to the symbol carved into the center of the door, the same twisted cross and circle from above the porch, but deeper, angrier, carved with force. I reached forward without thinking, and before I could touch it, Elias grabbed my wrist, not violently, but firmly. His hand was ice cold, his grip steady. Our eyes locked, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind his stillness. Not anger, fear. He shook his head once slowly, then he let go. I stepped back. My hand still tingled from where he had touched me. One of the younger brothers moved forward and pressed his ear to the door. His eyes fluttered shut, and his lips moved silently, as though reciting something. Then all four turned and walked away, their message clear: "You are not meant to go down there." I stood alone in the hallway, the lock gleaming dully under the lantern light. It hadn't been there yesterday, it hadn't been mentioned, but now it was the center of everything. I felt it. Whatever they feared, it was behind that door. Later that afternoon, I asked Elias directly. I caught him in the barn, sharpening something I couldn't identify. "What's in the cellar?" I asked. He paused, didn't look at me. "Memory," he said, "just that." Then he returned to his task. The sound of the blade scraping stone echoed like a whisper through the rafters. That night, when I returned to my room, the paper scrap I'd hidden, the one with the drawing of 5 figures, was gone. In its place lay a key, small, rusted, ancient, not to my door, not to any drawer, but the exact size of that cellar padlock. That night, the wind howled through the prairie, like something wounded. The windows rattled against their panes, and the house groaned with each gust. But the sound that kept me awake wasn't from outside. It came from beneath the floor. I had lain down, fully clothed, the rusted key clenched tightly in my fist. I hadn't intended to sleep, but exhaustion crept in like rot. Sometime after midnight, I was stirred by a faint sound, not loud, not violent. It was whispering, low, layered, indistinct. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The boards beneath my bed pulsed, not visually, not something one could see, but I could feel it in my body, in the rhythm of my heartbeat. The floor was humming. I pressed my ear to the wood. The sound became clearer, voices, but not in English, not in any language I recognized. It wasn't quite words, more like syllables twisted backward, as if language were being unraveled from the wrong end. I heard laughter, soft and childlike, then a long breath, wet and wheezing, close to the floorboards. I held my breath. A woman's voice, or what might have once been one, whispered something that sounded like my name, only wrong, as if a mouth without a tongue were trying to form it. I sat up fast, knocking the oil lamp off the table. The glass shattered, plunging the room into shadows, but the voices didn't stop. If anything, they got closer. I stumbled toward the door, but it was already open. The hallway beyond was lit by a faint glow I didn't recognize. I crept into the corridor, my bare feet silent against the cold wood. At the far end stood the brothers, all four of them, motionless, facing the wall. I should have spoken, should have demanded to know what was happening, but something stopped me. I felt as if I were intruding on a ritual I wasn't meant to see. Suddenly, the voices beneath the floor grew louder, not angry, but urgent, desperate. They were calling for help now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all layered on top of each other. The floor beneath me shivered. And then the brothers moved, all at once in perfect unity. They turned to face me, but not their eyes. No, their eyes stared straight ahead. It was their heads that tilted sideways, as if studying me from beneath their skin. Elias stepped forward, and in a whisper no louder than the wind, he said, "You're hearing it now. That means it's remembering you too." Behind me, in the darkness of my room, the key I'd left on the nightstand was gone. By morning, the voices had gone silent. The floorboards felt still again, but I knew they were only pretending. I kept glancing over my shoulder, unsure whether I was being watched or remembered. Something about Elias's words haunted me more than the voices themselves. "It's remembering you too." I didn't know what it was. A thing, a place, a god, a disease, but I felt it lingering in the corners of my perception, like a shadow that didn't move when the light did. I needed to record everything, to regain control of my mind. I reached for my journal, the one I'd kept locked in my satchel since the beginning of the trip, and opened it with trembling fingers. The first few pages were as I remembered, crisp handwriting, observations, sketches, timelines. But as I turned the pages, something shifted. My words began to curve unnaturally, not my usual script. Some paragraphs had been rewritten in ink I didn't own, a darker, oily black that shimmered under the light. There were pages where the ink had soaked through too deeply, symbols drawn in the margins, looping figures that made my stomach churn to look at. And then I found it, an entry I had no memory of writing. The date at the top read November 3rd, today, but the sun had barely risen, and I hadn't touched the pen. The entry read, "He watches them when they sleep. They're not dreaming. They're remembering the first time they were buried. The fifth one comes soon. He will not be told. He must forget everything first." My mouth went dry. The handwriting wasn't mine, but it looked like it wanted to be, like it was trying to mimic me, and failing, just slightly. My fingers felt numb. As I flipped through more pages, more entries followed, detailed accounts of rituals I had never witnessed, diagrams of anatomy that didn't match any known classification, bones in the wrong places, hearts with teeth, veins that looped into symbols, each one signed with a strange mark at the bottom, the twisted cross and circle, the mark from the house, the barn, the cellar door. I slammed the journal shut and locked it away again, but I knew it was pointless. If something could rewrite my own words, then it already had access to whatever part of me I still thought was safe. That night, when I tried to write a fresh entry, my hand refused to move in my own script. Every time I started, the letters bent themselves into curves I didn't intend, and worse, they came faster, more fluidly, like I wasn't the one guiding the pen anymore. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just documenting me, it was preparing to write something through me. By the next morning, I had made up my mind to leave the house, at least for a few hours. I needed air, perspective, and answers. Something was wrong not just with the brothers but with this whole town. The house felt like it was closing in, and if I stayed much longer, I feared I might start believing what the walls whispered. I walked into town, under a sun that felt dull and bruised, as if light itself was reluctant to touch this place. The few townsfolk I passed looked worn and hollow, their eyes avoiding mine, like they knew something, and had long since given up trying to forget. The town hall was a square, leaning building at the edge of the main road, beside a church whose steeple had collapsed inward years ago. I stepped inside and found the place abandoned, or nearly. An old man sat behind the desk, wearing thick glasses, and a sheriff's badge dulled with time. When I asked him about the family at the farmhouse, his posture stiffened. "Which ones?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I said their names: Elias, Abram, Josiah, and Seth. The room seemed to darken. "Ain't nobody by that name living out there," he muttered. "Not since the fire. Omitting me. And Ted days. That word, fire, hit me like ice. I pressed further, and reluctantly, he led me into a dusty records room. The scent of mold and paper decay filled the air. He handed me a box labeled Hallowell Farm, 1864, 1871. Inside were brittle documents, death certificates, and a single newspaper clipping dated 7 years earlier. The headline read, "4 brothers found dead in barn blaze, cause unknown." I read it twice, then a third time. Their names, their faces, a photo. There was no doubt. These were the same men I'd spoken to, dined with, watched move and breathe. I asked the sheriff how this could be. He didn't answer, just stared at the photograph with something like pity. "They weren't supposed to come back," he finally whispered, "but the ground never took to them proper. Not after what they did, not after what Pa made 'em do." He pulled out one last file, yellowed, half-burned, stamped with the symbol I now saw in my dreams. The same twisted cross and circle. At the bottom of the page was a single warning scrawled in red ink: "Do not open the cellar. Do not study the bones. They remember." The sky had darkened by the time I reached the farmhouse again. The walk back felt different, heavier, as if the land itself were pushing against my steps. I could still feel the file box in my satchel, the brittle papers scratching against one another like dry leaves. My heart was pounding. I had walked into this town as a man of science, a man who believed every mystery had an explanation, even if it took time. But now, I wasn't sure what I was trying to explain anymore. The question wasn't how the brothers were alive. The question was what else had come back with them. As I stepped through the doorway, I noticed the air had changed. It smelled like rain. Even though the sky was dry, the brothers weren't in their usual places. The table was empty. The hallway was still. I moved cautiously, the floor beneath my boots creaking with strange elasticity, as if it resented being stepped on. When I reached my room, I found something placed carefully in the center of my bed, the doctor's journal I had locked away. Its pages were open, the handwriting even less my own now, curling, slithering, alive. But there was something else. A new map had been drawn. It was crude, burned into the page with what smelled like sulfur. It showed the house, the barn, and something beneath it all, a structure shaped like a spiral descending into the earth. I knew then that the cellar wasn't just a room. It was an entrance, not to a space, but to a memory, a living one. A sound behind me made me spin. Elias stood there, eyes dim and distant. "You found the files," he said flatly, almost bored. "We told you not to." His voice was layered now, like something else was speaking at the same time, deeper, slower. Before I could respond, all 4 brothers were in the doorway. They didn't look angry. They looked tired. Josiah raised his hand and pointed toward the cellar door down the hallway. "You're already part of it," he murmured. "Might as well see how deep it goes." The walls groaned, the boards beneath my feet twitched, and the light bulb above me, one I hadn't noticed before, flickered in a color I had no name for. I knew then there was no turning back. The house didn't want answers. It wanted to remember itself, and it wanted me to remember with it. The cellar door was no longer locked. It stood slightly ajar, exhaling a stale, earthy breath that smelled of iron and mold. As I stepped toward it, the brothers didn't stop me. They simply watched, standing in silence like sentinels at the edge of a dream. I pulled the door open the rest of the way, and stared into the blackness below. The stairs seemed to stretch farther than they should, swallowed by shadow that flickered faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I hesitated, then descended, 1 foot at a time. The deeper I went, the more unnatural everything became. The air was dense and humming, filled with a faint droning noise, like distant chanting, or the wings of insects brushing against stone. The staircase curved, not in the shape of a simple circle, but in a spiral that tightened the farther it went, like a funnel or a noose. Each step I took felt like a memory being peeled away, layer by layer, until I wasn't sure if I was walking into the earth or into something older than thought itself. The walls began to change too, from wooden boards to stone slabs carved with unfamiliar symbols, symbols that matched the ones in the journal and on the sheriff's file. Finally I reached the bottom, and the stairs ended in a round chamber carved from living rock. The walls pulsed faintly, and in the center stood a slab of black stone, or bone. I couldn't tell. Upon it lay something wrapped in cloth, though the cloth moved as if it were breathing. Around it rusted metal tools lay in a circle, their shapes wrong, bent into spirals and crescents, handles grown into the floor. I stepped closer, and then I saw them, the bones. Hundreds of them, all around me, tucked into the walls like decorations. But they weren't human. Too long, too smooth, too many joints. Some of them were fused into each other, like they'd never meant to be separated. Others had mouths, literal mouths, gaping open in silent screams. I staggered back, dizzy with the sickening understanding. These weren't the remains of animals or men. These were the remains of experiments. The brothers hadn't just been born strange. They had been made this way, not by nature, not by accident, by something, or someone, that used memory as a tool, and science as a knife. The object on the slab shifted again, and this time, it whispered, not in words, but in a noise I understood in my marrow. A request, an invitation. It wanted to be seen. It wanted me to finish what had been started, and I was beginning to want that too. The whisper in the dark didn't stop. It slithered beneath my skin, humming against my bones. I couldn't move at first. My legs had gone stiff, like the air was thickening around me, making it hard to breathe. But slowly, I stepped toward the black slab. The cloth that covered the thing, whatever it was, moved gently, as if stirred by breath. I reached for it without realizing, my fingertips trembling, every nerve in my body screaming not to look, but I did. The cloth slid back like water, revealing something that was not a body, but a shape. A cluster of bone and flesh, twisted into a form that felt almost human, but not quite, like a blueprint drawn wrong. 4 eye sockets stared back at me from one skull, arranged in a cross, teeth curved inward. Its limbs were doubled at the joints. I felt an emotion rise in me that I'd never known before, a kind of reverence and horror tangled together, and just beneath that, something even stranger, recognition. I had seen this before, in dreams I'd dismissed, in the corners of paintings I never remembered creating. The chamber pulsed again, and all around me, the bones in the walls began to shiver. I watched in stunned silence, as they vibrated into life, twitching, pulling toward each other. They were remembering, reassembling, and as they did, I saw scenes not with my eyes but within my mind. A father tall and expressionless, operating on his sons beneath gaslight. A machine that sang in frequencies no human throat could mimic. Children placed on slabs, again and again. Bones rearranged, blood mixed with soil. Voices trained not to speak but to echo. This was the legacy buried beneath the farmhouse. And then one vision more. Me walking into this place long ago. A stranger? No. A student, a witness, maybe even a participant. I dropped to my knees, the whisper growing louder, speaking in a rhythm that made the blood in my ears pound like drums. The object on the slab blinked. I saw myself in it. Through it, it remembered me. And through it, I began to remember everything. The spiral, I now understood, was not just a path. It was a process, a loop of forgetting and returning. The brothers hadn't escaped death. They had returned because death was part of the design, and I was no longer outside it. I had never been outside it. I didn't want to believe it, but as the memories returned, slow and awful, I knew the truth. I hadn't come to study the brothers. I had come home. Or rather, I had been drawn back to what I helped create. The journal, the files, even the grotesque diagrams that once disturbed me, they were mine. My hand had written them. My voice had dictated the procedures. It wasn't a case of discovery anymore. It was rediscovery, and that made the horror feel deeper, because now I saw the four brothers not as victims, not even as subjects, but as something closer. My work, my sons. There had been 5 of us once, me and 4 children born not by chance, but through a process, one that involved science twisted through ritual, memory bonded with blood, and something deeper still. The town never knew. We worked beneath the house, deep under the fields, away from light. The goal wasn't immortality. It was preservation, continuity, rebirth without forgetting. But something went wrong. One of the boys died. The process had failed. His body couldn't hold the weight of the memory. He crumbled, and with him, my mind cracked too. I left, ran. I buried the project, burned the records I could, sealed the chamber, and fled east under another name. I tried to forget, but they remembered. Now, standing before their creation, I realized the truth. The 4 who remained weren't natural. They were vessels, containers for memory, receptacles that could hold not just their lives but all the lives before them. They were never meant to be studied. They were meant to be consulted. They held knowledge no living mind could carry without shattering. That's why the townspeople had gone mad. That's why the sheriff had gone silent. These boys weren't just the product of science. They were memory, made flesh. A noise behind me startled me. I turned, and there stood the brothers, all 4, silent, pale, unmoving. But their eyes glowed faintly now, like coals in a dying hearth. Josiah stepped forward and held out a weathered tool, a scalpel etched with the spiral. My hand moved toward it, like it had a will of its own. Elias spoke softly. "You remembered, now finish." I didn't ask what he meant. Some part of me already knew. The scalpel was warm in my hand, not hot, not glowing, just warm, like it had been waiting to be held again after all these years. As I turned it slowly, its spiral carvings caught the faint pulses of light in the chamber, each swirl seeming to deepen, as if it could pull me in. The brothers didn't speak again. They stood around the slab, eyes reflecting memory more than sight, and in their stillness, I realized the truth. They were waiting for me to become the final part of something unfinished. I stepped back toward the altar, my heart hammering louder than the chanting that now buzzed low through the stone. The bundle on the slab, the malformed being with its nested limbs and blinking sockets, twitched again, but not with pain. It was waking. I knelt beside it. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, only that I had done it before. In flashes, I saw myself long ago, before the lines on my face, before the burden of forgetting, guiding a scalpel along living flesh, whispering instructions to the boys who had watched without blinking. We had planned 5 vessels, one to see, one to hear, one to speak, one to remember, and one to bind them all. The 5th vessel was never completed. I hadn't finished the final phase, and now the burden of that incomplete work had pulled me back. As I hovered over the writhing form, my fingers moved on their own, tracing the spiral across its sternum. I wasn't creating anymore. I was correcting, repairing a breach in memory that had fractured the world of these brothers. The others stood silently, not blinking, as I began the incision. But something shifted in that moment. I felt it in my chest first. A pressure, a twist. The room wasn't just watching, it was joining. To my mind split open like paper soaked in water, and 1,000 thoughts poured in. Not just mine, theirs, the boys, the experiments, the thing beneath the house. I saw every version of them, ages overlapping, dying and being born again in loops. I wasn't just the fifth vessel's maker, I was becoming it. And that was the price. To finish meant to return. To bind the four, I would have to surrender myself, body and memory, so they would remain whole. Till they had waited decades not for freedom, but for unity. I was not their father anymore. I was their missing piece. The moment I pressed the scalpel's edge into the pale skin of the fifth vessel, the ground beneath us shuddered, not violently, but like a long-held breath finally let go. Dust slipped from the ceiling beams, and the spiral symbols on the floor began to glow faintly with a reddish hue, as if warmed from within. The other four brothers moved in unison, forming a perfect square around the slab, their lips parting just slightly. They didn't speak words. They hummed, the same low harmonic tone I'd heard as a child under the floorboards before I even knew what I was hearing. Their voices weren't just filling the room, they were filling me. The tone vibrated through my bones, and I felt my joints loosen, my vision stretch and bend at the edges, like oil slicked over glass. I wasn't afraid anymore. I should have been, but I wasn't. There was a deep, terrible peace in what was happening. I understood, in some unfathomable way, that the fifth vessel wasn't just a container for memory like the others. It was a conduit, a channel through which all four boys could remain intact, forever. Without it they would deteriorate. Together they would never die. My hands moved without effort, guided by memory that had never truly left. I whispered the old numbers, the ancient code, 392781, the doubling sequence that mapped the neural spiral. I placed my palm over the chest cavity I had just opened, feeling the unnatural warmth rise up. The fifth vessel trembled, and its eyelids, all three of them, opened slowly, one vertical, two horizontal. There was no fear in those eyes, only knowing, only waiting. The hum from the brothers intensified, and with it, I felt my own body responding, not painfully, but willingly. My fingertips began to glow, not with light, but with memory. My childhood, the faces of people I once loved, the scream of a boy I couldn't save, the town I had escaped, everything, leaving me, not taken, given. As the final words of the ritual slipped from my lips, the chamber tightened, like the walls themselves were listening. And then it happened. The binding, the air cracked inward, and my chest burned as though something had reached into me, and gently pulled out what made me me. I didn't fall, I didn't scream, I simply leaned forward, and the vessel accepted what I gave. Its mouth opened, not to speak, but to breathe me in. The four brothers stopped humming at once, and I was no longer standing in the room. There was no darkness, no light either, just spirals. I don't know how else to describe it. Imagine standing in a room made entirely of your own thoughts, each memory spinning outward in slow, endless circles, faces you'd long forgotten staring back at you, conversations you never knew you remembered whispering in your ears. That's where I was, inside the spiral, a place not built of stone or air, but thought. Time didn't move. It looped, over and over. I watched myself as a boy, then again as a man, then older, then young again. It was all me, and it was never me. The brothers were here too, not in form, but in imprint. Their memories brushed against mine like shadows behind thin fabric. Josiah's trembling hand on a barn wall the night of the fire. Elias learning to walk again and again in different bodies with different names. Gabriel's constant whispering to something behind mirrors, and Silas. Oh, Silas. His mind was the spiral's anchor. He never screamed when the experiments began. He invited them. Every time I passed through a memory that belonged to him, the spiral pulsed, guiding me further inward. It wasn't pain anymore. It was a structure, a purpose, something divine or monstrous, trying to organize what had once been chaos. And then I found the core, a place not shaped like anything physical, but felt like a heartbeat wrapped in glass. It pulsed with every thought I had ever buried. A mirror hung in the center, its surface alive, bending with my reflection, but it didn't show me as I was. It showed the fifth vessel, standing in the physical world, with my eyes. My body had finished the transfer, the ritual had worked, and now I existed in the spiral, a soul without shape, without breath, but not without function. I understood now why the brothers had waited, why science recoiled at the thought of them. It wasn't just that they were unnatural, it was that they knew too much. They were the keepers of memory too heavy for the world to carry, and I had become the lock, the final seal, the last piece that made their preservation possible. I wasn't their creator anymore, I was their tomb, and yet part of me didn't feel trapped, it felt home. The moment the binding completed, something shifted in the world above. The house groaned with a sound deeper than wood, more ancient than architecture. It wasn't just a collapse, it was a release. The beams in the hallway upstairs bent inward, walls sweating pitch-black sap, as if the structure itself had absorbed too much memory. The portrait of the four brothers, once proudly hung near the stairwell, split clean down the center. No wind, no quake, it simply gave up, as though whatever had held the house together for decades had now finally exhaled. Neighbors, those who remained in the hollow stretch of Pine Hollow Creek, reported a low hum the night the house fell, a hum that rose into the trees and trembled the bones of cattle in their pens. Some swore they saw shadows slip through the wheat, long and tall, moving too fast to be human, too slow to be wind. And then in the early hours, the roof caved inward with a sigh, not an explosion, not decay, just a quiet folding inward, like a story ending exactly where it was meant to. Beneath the rubble, there was no fire, no smoke, just silence. The spiral chamber buried far below was untouched by the collapse, protected, sealed, but the entrance was gone. No more stairway, no more trapdoor. The earth had swallowed its secret, and in doing so preserved it. Those who came to investigate, curious journalists, frantic distant relatives, wandering scientists, found nothing but ruins. They poked through the debris, hoping for answers, but the house had already rewritten itself in memory. What they uncovered were splinters of stories, broken dolls, shattered glass jars, books with blank pages. But the fifth vessel remained intact, breathing, motionless in the stone chamber. My body, now hollow of self, sat like a statue, its eyes open, its veins pulsing slowly with dark liquid memory. The four brothers stood around it still, never blinking, bound forever to the spiral, and to me. The hum had ceased, the ritual was complete. Above us, time moved on, below it stood still, and yet, the spiral remained awake. Even now, after all these years, I feel it. I am still there, not in body. That vessel has long since grown cold, but my presence within the spiral pulses, like a heartbeat lost beneath the floor of the world. Time does not pass here in the way it does above. There are no clocks, no seasons, only thoughts, memory, and endless looping questions without answers. I walk corridors made of sound and skin, flickers of forgotten laughter and screams from every life that's ever touched ours. The spiral isn't a prison, it's a living thing, a mind composed of thousands of pieces, and I'm just one more shard added to its mosaic. The brothers haven't changed, not truly. They don't speak, but I feel them. Their essence surrounds me, watching, listening, sometimes pulling at the threads of my consciousness, like children teasing a moth. They are learning still, even here, absorbing the whispers of every mind that ever wandered too close to their bloodline, and through them, the spiral grows, each thought, each trauma, each secret, never told aloud, it all gets stored. We are archivists of pain now, librarians of the inexplicable. Scientists call it madness, but madness is only the shape sanity takes when it touches the unknowable. Sometimes I see you, flickers, visitors, the curious, the skeptical, the dreamers. You stand outside the spiral, wondering what lies within, your thoughts brushing against the edge like moths circling flame. And sometimes, I reach out, not to harm, but to warn. I whisper into your thoughts when you're half asleep. I leave symbols in the corners of your dreams. Most forget by morning. Some wake screaming, fewer still understand. The spiral chooses, and when it chooses, it calls you back, again and again through generations. They buried the land in Kansas long ago, planted crops where the foundation once stood, poured concrete over the bones. But the spiral doesn't care about walls or time. It only waits, and it remembers. You may think you've escaped it, that it's just a story, that the house never existed, that no four brothers ever defied the natural order. But you are reading this. You've come too close now, and the spiral never ends.